Go back to where you came from, you dirty people. Mrs. Anderson screamed from her front porch, her face twisted with hate. Her husband Robert stood behind her, nodding his head like a puppet. We don't want your kind in our neighborhood. The words hit James like stones thrown at glass windows. Grace grabbed James's hand and squeezed it tight. Her beautiful brown eyes filled with tears, but she kept her head high. The grocery bags in her other hand shook as she tried to stay calm. This was their third week in Maple Street, and the attacks were getting worse each day. Ignore them, my love, James whispered to his wife, but his own voice was breaking. He had promised Grace a better life in America, a place where their dreams could grow like flowers in spring. But now, standing in front of their small white house with the red door, he wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Little did they know that Mrs. Anderson was 3 months pregnant with a daughter who would one day change everything. And neither family could imagine that this hate-filled moment would be the beginning of a love story that would shake both their worlds forever. The Anderson family watched from their window as James and Grace walked up their front steps, their backs straight despite the storm of cruel words. Robert Anderson turned to his wife and said something that would haunt him for years to come. We'll make sure they never feel welcome here. But fate had other plans, and sometimes the strongest love grows in the most impossible places. This is just the beginning of our journey. The real story starts 3 years earlier, in a small town in Nigeria where 2 young hearts were about to make a choice that would change their lives forever. 3 years earlier, in the busy streets of Lagos, Nigeria, James walked home from his job at the bank with his head full of dreams. The sun was setting behind the tall buildings, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In his pocket was a letter that could change everything, an acceptance letter from an American university. Grace was waiting for him in their tiny apartment, stirring a pot of rice and stew. She looked up when he walked through the door, and her smile was brighter than all the lights in the city. "How was your day, my husband?" she asked, though they had only been married for 6 months. James pulled out the letter with shaking hands. "Grace, sit down. I have news that will either make you very happy or very scared." He opened the envelope slowly, like he was opening a treasure chest. The words on the page danced before his eyes. "Congratulations. You have been accepted into our engineering master's program." Grace's eyes grew wide as moons. She had always known her husband was smart, but America seemed as far away as the stars. "James, this is wonderful, but what about me? What about us?" Her voice was small, like a bird afraid to fly. "We go together," James said, pulling her into his arms. "I would never leave you behind. We'll build a new life there, away from all the struggles here. Our children will have better chances, better schools, better everything." But even as he said the words, fear crawled up his spine like a cold snake. Grace pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. She could hear his excitement, but also his worry. Moving to America meant leaving everything they knew, their families, their friends, their whole world. But love makes people brave, and Grace was ready to follow her husband anywhere, even to the edge of the earth. The next 6 months passed like pages turning in a book. James worked extra hours at the bank to save money, while Grace sold her jewelry and beautiful clothes to help pay for their trip. Every night, they sat together planning their future, drawing pictures of the house they would live in and the life they would build. Grace's mother cried every day. "America is too far," she said, holding her daughter's hands. "What if something happens? What if you need us?" But Grace's father understood the dream. He had always wanted to travel but never had the chance. "Go, my daughter," he whispered. "Chase the stars." James's parents were different. They were angry and scared. "Why leave Nigeria?" his father asked. "We have everything you need here. Family, tradition, respect." But James had made up his mind. He had seen too many smart young people waste their talents because there were not enough opportunities. The hardest part was getting all the papers ready. Visa applications, school documents, medical tests, it felt like climbing a mountain made of paperwork. Some nights, Grace would find James sitting at their small table, his head in his hands, wondering if they were making a mistake. What if they don't like us there? Grace asked one evening, folding clothes into their single suitcase. She had heard stories about how some Americans treated African people, and the thought made her stomach feel sick. James took her hands and looked into her eyes. We'll face whatever comes together. Love will protect us. But deep in his heart, he was just as scared as she was. Neither of them knew that in a few months, they would be standing in front of Robert and Margaret Anderson, experiencing hatred like they had never imagined. The day before they left Nigeria, Grace stood on her mother's porch and looked at the street where she had grown up. Everything looked the same: the mango tree, the little shop, the children playing football. But she knew this might be the last time she would see it all. Tomorrow she would be Mrs. James Williams, not just in Nigeria but in the whole wide world. The airplane was bigger than anything Grace had ever seen. She held James's hand so tight that her knuckles turned white as they walked up the steps. The flight attendant smiled at them, but Grace could see questions in her eyes. Where were these two young Africans going? Why did they look so nervous? 24 hours later, they landed in New York. The airport was like a small city, full of people speaking different languages and rushing in all directions. Grace had never seen so many different faces in one place. White people, black people, Asian people, all mixed together like colors on an artist's palette. But America was expensive, much more expensive than they had expected. The money James had saved seemed to disappear like water in the desert. They spent their first week in a small motel room, eating cheap food and wondering how they would survive. Maybe we should go back, Grace said one night, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking out the window at the strange new world. The city lights were beautiful, but they felt cold and unfriendly. James sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. Remember what we promised each other? We said we would try for 1 year. If things don't get better, then we can decide what to do. But his own confidence was shaking like leaves in a storm. The university was in a small town called Riverside, 3 hours away from New York. When they finally got there, everything looked different from the big city. The buildings were smaller, the people moved slower, and there were trees and grass everywhere. For the first time since leaving Nigeria, Grace smiled a real smile. They found a small apartment near the university with 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that could barely fit a couch. But it was theirs, and that made it feel like a palace. Grace hung up their wedding photo on the wall, and suddenly, the place felt like home. James started his classes the next week. Engineering was hard, much harder than he had expected, and all the other students seemed to know things he had never learned. Some professors were kind, but others looked at him like he didn't belong there. Still, he studied every night until his eyes burned, determined to prove that a boy from Nigeria could succeed in America. Grace found a job cleaning offices at night. It wasn't the kind of work she had dreamed of doing, but it paid the bills and left her days free to take English classes. Every morning, she would practice speaking like Americans, trying to lose her Nigerian accent. But at night, alone with James, she would speak in their native language, keeping a piece of home alive in their hearts. 6 months later, they had saved enough money to think about buying a small house. James had heard about a quiet neighborhood called Maple Street, where the houses were affordable and the schools were good. They didn't know that this decision would bring them face to face with the Anderson family, and a hatred that would test their love in ways they never imagined. The little white house with the red door looked like something from a fairy tale. Grace stood on the sidewalk, holding James's hand, and for the first time in months, she felt hope growing in her chest like a warm sunrise. The street was quiet and peaceful, with big trees that gave cool shade and neighbors who seemed to mind their own business. "This could be our home," James whispered, squeezing her hand. The real estate agent, a friendly woman named Mrs. Peterson, was already walking up the front steps with the keys. The house had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a backyard where Grace could plant the vegetables she missed from Nigeria. But as they walked through the empty rooms, Grace noticed something that made her stomach feel strange. Through the window, she could see the house next door, where a man was watching them from behind his curtains. When he saw Grace looking, he quickly moved away, but not before she caught the expression on his face: surprise, confusion, and something else that looked like anger. "Don't worry about the neighbors," Mrs. Peterson said cheerfully, noticing Grace's concerned look. The Andersons have lived here for 15 years. They keep to themselves mostly. But the way she said it made Grace wonder what she wasn't telling them. James was too excited to notice the warning signs. He walked through each room, already planning where they would put their furniture and how they would paint the walls. Grace, look at this kitchen. You can cook all your favorite Nigerian dishes here. And this bedroom will be perfect for when we have children. Grace smiled at her husband's enthusiasm, but something cold was creeping up her spine like ice water. As they signed the papers that afternoon, she kept thinking about the man next door and the way he had looked at them. In Nigeria, people might stare at strangers, but it was usually with curiosity, not with that hard, unfriendly expression. 3 days later, they moved in with their few belongings. James carried Grace over the threshold like they were newlyweds again, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But as they unpacked their boxes, they began to notice small things that weren't quite right. Someone had thrown trash on their front lawn. The mailbox had been knocked over, and every time they went outside, the curtains in the Anderson house would twitch, like eyes watching and waiting. Grace was hanging laundry in the backyard when she first met Margaret Anderson face to face. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Grace was humming a song from home while she clipped James's shirts to the line. She felt happy and peaceful, like maybe this new life was going to work out after all. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice from the fence that separated their yards. Grace turned around and saw a white woman about her age, with blonde hair pulled back tight and cold blue eyes.
"I'm Margaret Anderson.
"I live next door." But the way she said next door sounded like she was saying next to a snake. Grace smiled her brightest smile and walked over to the fence. "Hello, I'm Grace Williams. My husband James and I just moved in. It's so nice to meet you." She reached out her hand to shake, but Margaret stepped back like Grace's hand might burn her. "I just want you to know," Margaret said, her voice getting harder with each word, "that this has always been a quiet neighborhood. We like it that way. We don't want any trouble." The way she said trouble, while looking directly at Grace's face, made the message very clear. Grace's smile faded like a flower in winter. "We're very quiet people, Mrs. Anderson. We just want to live peacefully and be good neighbors." But even as she said the words, she could feel her heart starting to beat faster, like a drum warning of danger ahead. Margaret looked Grace up and down, from her colorful African head wrap to her bare feet in the grass. "We'll see about that," she said, and turned to walk back to her house. But before she reached her door, she called over her shoulder, "Oh, and Mrs. Williams, you might want to keep your music down at night." Grace stood by the fence for a long time after Margaret disappeared. They had never played music loud enough to bother anyone. Margaret was looking for reasons to complain, creating problems where none existed. Grace touched her belly without thinking, wondering what kind of world she and James were bringing their future children into. That evening, when James came home from the university, Grace told him about the encounter. She watched his face change from happiness to worry to anger, like clouds gathering before a storm. "What did she mean about trouble?" he asked, pacing around their small living room. "I think she means us, James. I think she means that we are the trouble just by being here, just by being black." The words tasted bitter in Grace's mouth, like medicine that was supposed to help but only made you feel sicker. 2 weeks after the fence conversation, the real problems began. Grace would wake up in the morning to find their trash cans knocked over, garbage scattered across their front yard like confetti from a nightmare party. James would come home to find his car blocked in the driveway by Robert Anderson's truck, forcing him to knock on their door and ask them to move it. "Sorry," Robert would always say with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Didn't realize I was in your way." But he would take his time moving the truck, whistling and checking his watch like he had all day to make James late for his classes. The worst part was the staring. Every time Grace stepped outside, she could feel eyes watching her from the Anderson house. When she went to check the mail, Margaret would suddenly appear in her garden, pretending to water plants while watching Grace's every move. When James worked in their yard on weekends, Robert would come out to wash his car, making loud comments about property values and certain kinds of people. Grace started to dread leaving the house, the grocery store, the library, even taking walks around the neighborhood. Everything felt like walking through a minefield where she never knew when the next explosion would come. Some of the other neighbors seemed nice enough, but none of them ever stopped to introduce themselves or offer friendship. "Maybe they're waiting for us to make the first move," James suggested one evening. He was trying to stay positive, but Grace could see the worry lines growing deeper around his eyes each day. Maybe they're just shy. Grace wanted to believe him, but in her heart, she knew better. She had seen the way people looked at them in the grocery store, some with curiosity, some with indifference, but others with that same cold hardness she saw in the Andersons' faces. It was like being back in those American movies she used to watch in Nigeria, except now she was living in the story, and it wasn't as exciting as it had seemed on screen. One particularly bad day, Grace came home from her English class to find someone had written ugly words on their mailbox with black marker. The words were so cruel and hateful that she couldn't even say them out loud. She spent an hour scrubbing the mailbox clean, crying angry tears that fell like rain on the metal surface. When James saw what had happened, something changed in his face. All his optimism and patience seemed to drain away like water from a broken cup. "That's it," he said quietly, but his voice was full of thunder. "I'm going next door to have a talk with our neighbors." Grace grabbed his arm. "No, James. That's what they want. They want us to get angry, to cause a scene, so they can call the police and say we're troublemakers." She could see the future stretching out before them like a dark road, more fights, more hatred, more reasons for people to say they didn't belong. But some storms can't be stopped, and the biggest one was just beginning to gather strength. Grace had been feeling sick for 2 weeks before she finally went to see the doctor. At first, she thought it was just stress from all the problems with their neighbors. Her stomach felt queasy, she was tired all the time, and the smell of James's morning coffee made her feel like she might throw up. "Mrs. Williams," Dr. Martinez said with a warm smile, "I have some wonderful news for you. You're going to have a baby." She held up the test results like they were a winning lottery ticket. Grace stared at the paper, her mind spinning like a top. A baby. Here. Now. In this place where they weren't wanted, where people wrote hateful words on their mailbox and treated them like enemies. For a moment, she didn't know if she wanted to laugh or cry. "How far along am I?" she asked, her voice sounding far away, like it was coming from someone else's mouth. "About 2 months," the doctor replied. "The baby should arrive in early spring." "Congratulations." But Dr. Martinez noticed the worried expression on Grace's face. "Is everything all right? You don't seem happy about the news." Grace forced a smile. "I'm just surprised. My husband and I wanted children, but we didn't expect it so soon." What she didn't say was that she was terrified. How could they protect a baby from the hatred that surrounded them? How could they raise a child in a place where people might hate their little one just because of the color of their skin? When James came home that evening, Grace was sitting at their kitchen table, staring out the window at the Anderson house. She had been trying all day to figure out how to tell him about the baby. Should she be excited? Should she be worried? Should they consider moving somewhere else? "Grace, you look like you've seen a ghost," James said, hanging up his jacket and coming to sit beside her. "What's wrong? Did something else happen with the neighbors?" Grace took his hands in hers and looked into his eyes. "James, I went to the doctor today." She watched his face change from casual concern to serious worry.
I'm pregnant.
For a moment, James was completely still, like someone had pressed a pause button on his life. Then, suddenly, his face broke into the biggest smile Grace had seen since they had arrived in America. He jumped up, grabbed her hands, and spun her around the kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby!" he shouted, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "Grace, we're having a baby." He set her down gently and placed his hands on her stomach, even though there was nothing to feel yet. "Our child will be American, Grace. Born here with all the rights and opportunities we came here to find." But even as they celebrated, Grace couldn't shake the worry that was growing in her heart like a weed. Through their kitchen window, she could see Margaret Anderson hanging laundry in her backyard. Margaret's movements looked different somehow, slower, more careful, and Grace wondered if their neighbor might be dealing with her own secret news. That night, as James slept peacefully beside her, Grace lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about their baby grow, about the world they would bring their child into, about the neighbors who might hate their little one before they even had a chance to know them. But she also thought about love, and how sometimes the strongest plants grow in the hardest soil. Neither Grace nor James knew that at that very same moment, Margaret Anderson was lying awake in the house next door, her hands resting on her own growing belly, wondering how she was going to tell Robert about the baby that would arrive just 1 month after Grace's child was born. The morning Grace went into labor, spring rain was falling softly on Maple Street like tears of joy from heaven. James drove faster than he had ever driven before, his hands shaking on the steering wheel as Grace breathed deeply in the passenger seat. "Almost there, my love," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Grace or to their unborn child. 8 hours later, David Williams came into the world with a cry so loud that the nurses in the hallway smiled. He was perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and eyes that seemed to look right into his parents' souls. Grace held him against her chest and felt her heart grow 3 times bigger, like it was making room for all the love she didn't know she had inside her. "He's beautiful," James whispered, touching his son's soft cheek with one finger. "He looks just like you, Grace." But David had James's stubborn chin and his grandmother's wise eyes, like he already knew secrets about the world that would take years to understand. 1 month later, on a sunny May morning, Margaret Anderson gave birth to her daughter Emma in the same hospital where David had been born. Emma came into the world quietly, like she was already thinking about everything around her. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's golden hair, but something in her face was softer than either parent, like she had inherited kindness from some distant relative. For the first few months, the 2 babies lived side by side without knowing each other existed. Grace would push David in his stroller around the neighborhood, singing Nigerian lullabies that made him smile and coo. Margaret would sit in her front yard with Emma, reading books about how to raise perfect children and making sure every blanket was folded just right. The other neighbors watched both families with interest. Some whispered about how different the 2 mothers were, Grace with her colorful head wraps and musical voice, Margaret with her crisp white clothes and quiet manner. But nobody could have predicted what would happen when the 2 children finally met. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when David was 8 months old. Grace was working in her front garden, pulling weeds while David sat on a blanket nearby, playing with wooden blocks that James had painted bright red and yellow. The sun was warm, the flowers were blooming, and for once, Grace felt peaceful in their neighborhood. Suddenly, a small white ball rolled across the grass and stopped right next to David's blanket. Emma Anderson, now 7 months old and just learning to crawl, had escaped from her mother's watchful eye and was chasing the ball with determination that surprised everyone who saw her. David looked up from his blocks and stared at the little girl with golden hair and blue eyes. Emma looked back at the little boy with dark skin and the biggest smile she had ever seen. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, like they were trying to solve a puzzle that adults had been working on for centuries. Then David did something that changed everything. He picked up one of his blocks, the bright yellow one, and held it out to Emma like he was offering her a piece of sunshine. Emma took the yellow block and immediately put it in her mouth, the way babies do with everything they find interesting. David laughed, a sound like tiny bells ringing, and Emma laughed back. Just like that, the first friendship was born between the houses on Maple Street. Grace looked up from her garden and saw the 2 babies sitting together on the blanket, sharing blocks and making happy baby sounds at each other. Her heart felt warm and hopeful for the first time in months. Maybe, she thought, the next generation could be different. Maybe these children could teach their parents how to be neighbors. But then she heard footsteps running fast across the grass, and Margaret Anderson appeared like a storm cloud blocking the sun. "Emma!" she called sharply, scooping up her daughter so quickly that the baby started to cry. "Emma!" You can't just crawl away like that. Margaret held Emma tight against her chest and looked down at Grace with eyes that were more scared than angry. I'm sorry, she said stiffly. Emma is still learning about boundaries. But the way she said boundaries sounded like she meant much more than just staying in the yard. It's no problem at all, Grace replied gently, standing up and brushing dirt from her knees. The children seemed to enjoy meeting each other. David doesn't often get to play with other babies his age. She smiled hopefully, thinking maybe this could be a new beginning. Margaret looked at David, who was still holding out blocks toward Emma and making frustrated baby sounds because his new friend had been taken away. For just a moment, Margaret's face softened, like she was remembering what it felt like to be innocent and see only goodness in the world. Perhaps, Margaret started to say, then stopped herself. She looked back at her house, where Grace could see Robert watching from the window, his arms crossed and his face dark with disapproval. Perhaps we should let them get a little older first, Margaret finished weakly. As Margaret carried Emma back to their yard, the little girl kept looking over her mother's shoulder at David, reaching her tiny hands toward him like she was trying to hold onto their moment of friendship. David watched them go, then threw his remaining blocks on the ground and started to cry. Grace picked up her son and held him close, kissing his forehead and whispering, "Don't worry, my little love. Good things are worth waiting for." But in her heart, she wondered if their children would have to wait their whole lives to be friends, or if love would find a way to grow despite all the walls their parents had built. That night, Grace told James about the meeting between David and Emma. They sat in their living room, David asleep in Grace's arms, talking quietly about what it meant and what it might mean for the future. Children don't see color the way adults do, James said thoughtfully. They just see other children. Maybe our son can teach their daughter things she won't learn from her parents. But he also knew that innocence doesn't last forever, and someday both children would have to learn about the complicated world they had been born into. Neither Grace nor James knew that at that very moment, in the house next door, Emma was refusing to sleep, fussing and crying until Margaret finally gave her a yellow stuffed toy that reminded her of the block David had shared. Only then did Emma close her eyes and dream peaceful dreams about a boy with a sunny smile and kind hands. By the time David and Emma turned 2 years old, they had developed a secret friendship that their parents couldn't stop, no matter how hard they tried. The backyard fence between the two houses had a loose board that created a small gap, just big enough for 2 determined toddlers to squeeze through when no one was looking. David learned to walk by pulling himself up on furniture and taking shaky steps toward the fence, like Emma was a magnet drawing him across the yard. Emma learned to climb by figuring out how to get over her mother's carefully built barriers to reach the gap in the fence. When the two children were together, they created their own little world where skin color didn't matter and friendship was as natural as breathing. Grace discovered their secret meetings one afternoon when she heard 2 voices singing in her backyard, David's deeper baby voice mixing with Emma's higher one. She looked out the kitchen window and saw them sitting under her apple tree, sharing cookies and playing with a collection of toys from both houses. Instead of stopping them, Grace did something that surprised even herself. She made 2 extra cookies, poured 2 small cups of milk, and quietly left the snacks on the back steps before returning to the kitchen to watch through the window. When the children found the treats, they looked around with wide eyes, then clapped their hands and hugged each other like they had discovered treasure. Margaret knew about the secret meetings too, but she was torn between her husband's anger and her daughter's happiness. Every day, Emma would cry when she couldn't find David, and every day, Margaret's heart broke a little more. She had never seen her daughter so joyful as when she was playing with the little boy from next door. "You have to stop this," Robert told his wife one evening, pacing around their living room like a caged animal. "People are starting to talk. Mrs. Henderson saw Emma playing with that boy yesterday. What are they going to think about our family?" Margaret watched Emma through the window, seeing her daughter's face pressed against the glass, looking toward David's house with longing that seemed too big for such a small child. "She's just a baby, Robert. She doesn't understand about differences." "That's exactly why we need to stop it now," Robert replied, his voice getting harder. before she gets too attached, before she starts thinking this is normal. But even as he said the words, he could see the sadness growing in his daughter's eyes, and it made something hurt deep in his chest. The next day, Robert built a higher fence. Then he put locks on all the gates. Then he started watching Emma every minute she was outside, making sure she couldn't escape to find her friend. But love, especially the pure love between children, is harder to stop than water flowing downhill. David and Emma found new ways to see each other. They would press their faces against their bedroom windows at night and wave before going to sleep. They would leave each other gifts by the fence, flowers, pretty rocks, drawings made with crayons. When Emma got sick with a cold and couldn't go outside for a week, David sat by the fence every day, waiting for her to come back. "Mama," David said to Grace one morning, pointing toward the Anderson house. "Emma's sad." His words were still simple, but his feelings were as deep as an ocean. He could sense his friend's unhappiness even when he couldn't see her. Grace knelt down and hugged her son close. "Sometimes, little one, people put up walls because they're scared. But love always finds a way." She didn't know if she was talking to David or to herself, but she hoped with all her heart that the words were true. When David and Emma turned 3, something magical happened that no adult could have planned or predicted. It was Emma's birthday, and Margaret had organized a perfect party in their backyard. Pink balloons, a princess cake, and gifts wrapped in shiny paper. But Emma sat in her party dress looking sadder than any child should look on their birthday. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, kneeling down beside her daughter. "Don't you like your presents?" Emma looked up with tears in her blue eyes. "Where's David?" she asked in her small, clear voice. "David should come to my party. David is my best friend." Margaret felt her heart crack like an egg. She looked around at all the neighborhood children who had been invited, all white, all from families that Robert approved of, and realized that none of them made Emma smile the way David did. Her daughter was surrounded by people, but she was lonely without her true friend. "Honey, David is different from us," Margaret said carefully, trying to find words that a 3-year-old would understand without learning hatred. "His family and our family we don't usually." "David has the same birthday as me," Emma interrupted, her little chin sticking out with determination. "We should have the same party." And that's when Margaret realized something that changed everything. Emma was right, both children had been born in the spring, just 1 month apart. They were growing up side by side, learning about the world at the same time, asking the same questions about why the sky is blue and where butterflies come from. While Margaret was thinking, Emma made a decision that would become a family legend. She picked up a piece of her birthday cake, the biggest piece with a pink frosting rose, and marched straight to the fence between the yards. "David," she called through the gap in the boards. "Come have cake." David appeared so quickly it was like he had been waiting by the fence all day. Grace was right behind him, worried about what the neighbors would say but unable to disappoint her son when he looked so happy. The other children at the party stared with wide eyes as David squeezed through the fence gap, his clothes getting dusty and his face breaking into the biggest smile anyone had ever seen. Emma handed him the cake and a plastic fork, and the 2 children sat cross-legged on the grass, eating and giggling like they were the only people in the world. "This is the best party ever," Emma announced to everyone watching, chocolate frosting on her chin and happiness shining in her eyes. Margaret looked around at the faces of the other parents, some shocked, some confused, some openly disapproving. She thought about Robert, who was at work and would be furious when he heard about this. She thought about what the neighbors would say, what it might mean for their reputation in the community. Then she looked at her daughter's face, glowing with pure joy, and made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. "Would you like to stay for the rest of the party, David?" she asked softly. Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Are you sure, Mrs. Anderson? We don't want to cause any problems." Margaret looked at Grace, really looked at her, and saw not a threat or a stranger, but another mother who loved her child and wanted him to be happy. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that it's time we stopped being afraid of happiness." For the next hour, David and Emma played together at the party while their mothers sat side by side, making awkward but genuine conversation about raising toddlers and the challenges of being far from their own families. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was something new growing between two houses that had been separated by fear for too long. But storms were still coming, and the hardest tests of love were still ahead. When David and Emma started kindergarten at Riverside Elementary School, they thought they would finally be able to be friends openly, without sneaking through fence gaps or meeting in secret. But the world outside their neighborhood proved to be even more complicated than the world between their two houses. On the first day of school, Emma ran straight to David when she saw him in the classroom, grabbing his hand like she had done 1,000 times before. "David, we're in the same class," she announced happily to everyone around them. But instead of smiles, they got stares. The other children looked confused, and some whispered to each other behind their hands. Mrs. Thompson, their teacher, watched with worried eyes as the two children sat together at the yellow table, sharing crayons and talking about everything they wanted to learn. By lunchtime, the problems had started. A boy named Kyle, whose father worked with Robert Anderson, pointed at David and Emma sitting together and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "My dad says those people shouldn't mix with our people." Emma's face turned red with anger. Even at 5 years old, she knew that Kyle was saying something mean about her best friend. "David is nice," she shouted back. "You're the one who's mean." But the damage was done, and other children started choosing sides without even understanding what they were choosing. David felt confused and hurt in a way he had never felt before. At home, his parents had taught him that he was smart and good and could do anything he dreamed of. But at school, some children treated him like he was different in a bad way, like there was something wrong with him that he couldn't fix or change. "Mama," David asked Grace that evening, "why don't some kids want to play with me? Kyle said I'm different, but I don't feel different." Grace's heart broke as she knelt down to look into her son's innocent eyes. She had hoped he could stay protected from racism a little longer, but the world had found him anyway. Some people, baby, have learned to be afraid of differences instead of celebrating them. But you are perfect exactly as you are. Emma was having her own difficult conversation at the Anderson dinner table. Robert had heard about the incident at school from Kyle's father, and he was angrier than Emma had ever seen him. "Emma, you cannot keep being friends with that boy," Robert said, his voice sharp as broken glass. "People are talking about our family. Your mother and I have worked too hard to build our reputation in this community." "But David is my friend," Emma protested, her eyes filling with tears. "He's nice to me. He shares his toys and he makes me laugh." Margaret watched her husband and daughter fight, feeling torn between two worlds. Part of her agreed with Robert life would be easier if Emma chose friends from families more like theirs. But another part of her remembered the pure joy on Emma's face every time she played with David, and wondered if they were making a terrible mistake. "You can make other friends," Robert continued. "Friends whose families share our values and our background." That night, Emma cried herself to sleep, not understanding why the adult world was so complicated and cruel. Down the hall, Margaret lay awake listening to her daughter's quiet sobs and wondering when protecting their child had started to feel like hurting her instead. By the time David and Emma reached middle school, the pressure from their families and community had created an invisible wall between them that grew higher every year. They still lived next door to each other, still caught glimpses of each other through windows and in passing, but they had learned to pretend they were strangers. David threw himself into his studies, becoming the smartest kid in every class and earning respect through his intelligence and kindness. He joined the debate team, played basketball, and made friends with other students who judged him by his character rather than his skin color. But every day, he felt the empty space where Emma's friendship used to be. Emma became popular with the girls Robert approved of, daughters of doctors and lawyers and business owners who lived in the nicer part of town. She learned to dress the right way, talk the right way, and smile at the right people. But inside, she felt like she was acting in a play where she had forgotten who she really was supposed to be. The hardest moments were when they passed each other in the hallways at school. David would feel his heart speed up when he saw Emma's golden hair in the crowd, and Emma would feel butterflies in her stomach when she heard David's voice answering questions in class. But they had both learned to look away, to pretend they didn't notice each other, to protect themselves from the pain of a friendship they couldn't have. One autumn afternoon, Emma was walking home from school with her new friends when she saw David sitting alone on a bench, reading a book about engineering. Her friends were talking about some party they were planning, but Emma couldn't concentrate on their words. All she could think about was how lonely David looked, and how much she missed talking to someone who understood the way her mind worked. "Emma, are you even listening?" asked Jennifer, one of her friends whose father owned the biggest car dealership in town. "Sorry," Emma said, forcing herself to look away from David. "I was just thinking about the math homework." "You think too much," Jennifer laughed. "That's your problem. Boys don't like girls who are too smart." But Emma remembered that David had always liked her questions and her ideas, had never made her feel like being smart was something to hide or apologize for. David noticed Emma walking by with her friends, heard them laughing about things that seemed silly and unimportant. He wondered if Emma was happy with her new life, if she ever missed their conversations about everything and nothing. Sometimes he would dream about running up to her and asking if she remembered the time they built a fort out of cardboard boxes, or the day they found a butterfly with a broken wing and took care of it until it could fly again. But dreams were all he had now, and middle school was teaching both children that some dreams were considered impossible by the adult world around them. The worst day came in 8th grade, when Emma was chosen to be on the academic decathlon team, the same team David had been captain of for 2 years. For 6 weeks, they had to practice together every day after school, sitting in the same room, working on the same problems, pretending they didn't know each other better than anyone else in the world. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Other team members noticed the strange way David and Emma avoided looking at each other, how they never worked together even though they would have been the strongest partnership. Mrs. Garcia, the teacher who coached the team, finally pulled them aside after a particularly awkward practice session. "David, Emma, have you two had some kind of fight?" she asked kindly. "You both seem uncomfortable around each other, and it's affecting the whole team." David and Emma looked at each other for the first time in months, really looked, and saw all the years of friendship and loss reflected in each other's eyes. The silence stretched between them like a bridge they were both afraid to cross. "We used to be friends," Emma said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "When we were little." "What happened?" Mrs. Garcia asked gently. David and Emma looked at each other again, and both knew the same complicated truth. Nothing had happened between them. Everything had happened around them. Family pressure, social expectations, fear and prejudice. But between the two of them, nothing had changed at all. High school brought new freedoms and new challenges. David had grown tall and handsome, with his father's strong shoulders and his mother's warm smile. He was student council president, captain of the debate team, and had already been accepted to 3 different universities with full scholarships. Everyone said he was going places, that he would be successful in whatever he chose to do. Emma had grown beautiful, with long golden hair and eyes that seemed to see more than most people noticed. She was valedictorian of her class, editor of the school newspaper, and had been accepted to the same university where James had gotten his engineering degree. But despite all her achievements, she felt like she was living someone else's life. The cruel irony was that success had made both teenagers more attractive to each other, not less. David would watch Emma give speeches at school assemblies and remember the little girl who had shared her birthday cake with him. Emma would see David accepting awards and recall the boy who had offered her his favorite toy without thinking twice. Their junior year, they were both selected for a special advanced placement program that met on Saturday mornings. For the first time in years, they were forced to work together on group projects, and slowly, carefully, they began to rediscover the friendship they had lost. It started with small things. David would hold the door open for Emma, and she would say thank you, with a smile that made his heart skip. Emma would ask David for help with a chemistry problem, and he would explain it so patiently that she remembered why she used to think he was the smartest person in the world. "We used to be good friends," Emma said one Saturday morning as they worked on a history project about civil rights. The irony of the topic wasn't lost on either of them. "I remember," David replied softly. You saved me a piece of your birthday cake. You gave me your favorite yellow block. Emma smiled, and for a moment, they were 5 years old again, sitting under Grace's apple tree sharing cookies and secrets. But they were also 17 years old, and what they were feeling was no longer simple childhood friendship. David found himself thinking about Emma when he should have been studying. Emma caught herself looking for David in crowded hallways and feeling disappointed when she didn't see him. The realization that they were falling in love, really, truly falling in love, terrified them both. Childhood friendship was one thing, but teenage romance between a black boy and a white girl in their community was something else entirely. They had both heard the stories, seen the movies, knew how these stories usually ended. "This is dangerous," Emma whispered to David one afternoon when they were alone in the library, supposedly working on their college application essays. "What we're feeling, people won't understand." David reached across the table and almost touched her hand, then pulled back at the last second. "I know," he said, "but I can't stop feeling it. Can you?" Emma looked into his eyes and saw everything she had been trying to deny. She saw love, pure and strong and honest, and she saw fear, realistic and justified and heartbreaking. "No," she whispered, "I can't stop it either." From that moment on, they were walking a tightrope between love and safety, between following their hearts and protecting their families. They had secret conversations after school, past notes disguised as homework assignments, and fell deeper in love every day while knowing that the world around them would never approve. But love, especially young love, is optimistic and stubborn and believes it can conquer anything. David and Emma began to dream about college, about getting away from Maple Street and all its complications, about finding a place where they could be together without hiding. What they didn't know was that their parents had been watching, worrying, and making plans of their own. Senior year arrived like a storm on the horizon, full of promise and danger, hope and fear. David had been accepted to Stanford University with a full scholarship to study engineering, following in his father's footsteps but reaching even higher than James had ever dreamed. Emma had been accepted to the same university for journalism, though her parents assumed she would choose the local college where they could keep an eye on her. The night Emma got her acceptance letter from Stanford, she sat in her room holding the paper and crying tears that were half joy and half terror. Stanford meant freedom. Stanford meant following her dreams of becoming a real journalist who could tell important stories and change the world. Stanford also meant being thousands of miles away from everything she had ever known. But most importantly, Stanford meant being in the same place as David. She hadn't told him about her application, hadn't dared to hope they might end up at the same school. But now, holding the letter in her shaking hands, she realized that fate might be giving them a chance that their hometown never would. David was in his room that same night, looking at his own Stanford acceptance letter and thinking about Emma. He had seen her in the hallway that day, heard rumors that she had gotten some kind of important news, noticed the way she looked both excited and scared. He wondered if she had been accepted somewhere far away, wondered if he would spend the next 4 years missing her even more than he already did. Neither of them knew that downstairs, their parents were having the most serious conversations of their lives. Grace and James sat at their kitchen table, David's letter spread out between them like a map to a new world. "He'll be so far away," Grace said, her voice thick with tears. She was trying not to cry. "California might as well be another planet. It's what we always wanted for him," James reminded her gently. "The best education, the best opportunities. We came to America so he could have chances like this." "I know," Grace nodded. "But I also know he's in love with that girl next door. What if they end up at the same school? What if people there are just as prejudiced as people here? What if something terrible happens to him?" James reached across the table and took his wife's hands. "We have to trust that we raised him right. We have to trust that love can be stronger than hate. And we have to trust that our son is smart enough to take care of himself and anyone he loves." Next door, Robert and Margaret were having a very different conversation. Robert paced around their living room like a caged animal, his face red with anger and fear. "She cannot go to Stanford," he said for the 10th time. "It's too far away, too expensive, and too liberal." Robert, it's one of the best schools in the country, Margaret said quietly. Emma has worked so hard for this. Her grades, her activities, her essays. She deserves this chance. She deserves to be safe, Robert shouted. She deserves to marry a good man from a good family and raise children who won't have to face the kind of problems that come from mixing with the wrong people. Margaret looked at her husband and saw fear where she had once seen strength. Are you talking about Emma's education? Or are you talking about David Williams? The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to fill the room like smoke. Robert sat down heavily in his chair and put his head in his hands. Both, he admitted finally. I've seen the way she looks at him, Margaret. I've seen the way he looks at her. If they end up at the same college, then maybe they'll have a chance to find out if what they feel is real, Margaret said, surprising herself with her own words. Maybe they'll learn that love is more important than the color of someone's skin. Robert looked up at his wife with eyes full of shock and betrayal. How can you say that? How can you even think it? Margaret thought about all the years she had watched Emma and David grow up, all the time she had seen Emma's face light up when David was around, all the conversations she had overheard where Emma defended David against cruel comments from classmates. Because, she said slowly, I think our daughter already knows something that we're afraid to learn. The battle lines were being drawn, and the two young people at the center of the storm had no idea that their futures were being decided in late-night conversations they couldn't hear. College was still months away, but the fight for their right to love each other was about to begin. The secret that David and Emma had kept so carefully finally exploded into the open on a warm spring evening, just 2 months before graduation. Emma had been meeting David at the old oak tree behind the school library, the same place where they used to hide as children, and they had been talking about their Stanford acceptances and what it might mean for their future. We could really try this time, David said, taking Emma's hand in both of his. Away from here, away from all the people who think they know what's best for us. We could see if what we feel is strong enough to build a real life on. Emma looked into his eyes and saw her whole future reflected there. Not the safe, predictable future her parents had planned, but a future full of possibility and challenge and love. I'm scared, she admitted, but I'm more scared of spending my life wondering what could have been. That was the moment when Jennifer Martinez, Emma's supposed best friend, stepped out from behind another tree with her phone held high, having recorded everything. This is going to be very interesting, Jennifer said with a cruel smile. Wait until everyone at school sees this video. Emma's face went white as paper. Jennifer, please. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand perfectly, Jennifer replied, her voice cold as winter ice. I understand that Emma Anderson thinks she's too good for boys from her own community. I understand that she's been lying to everyone, including her parents. And I understand that people have a right to know the truth. David stepped protectively in front of Emma, his hands clenched into fists. Delete that video, Jennifer. This is between Emma and me. It has nothing to do with you. Everything has to do with everyone in a community like ours, Jennifer shot back. Your parents came here thinking they could just fit in, but some people need to learn their place. The video was online within an hour. By midnight, it had been shared dozens of times. By morning, it seemed like everyone in Riverside had seen it. David and Emma holding hands, talking about love, making plans for a future together. The comments were brutal, the reactions were explosive, and the phone calls to both houses started before sunrise. Grace Williams was making coffee when the first call came. Mrs. Williams, said a voice she didn't recognize. I just wanted you to know that your son is involved with a white girl from your neighborhood. I thought you should know what kind of trouble he's getting himself into. James took the phone from his wife's trembling hands. Who is this? He demanded. But the caller had already hung up, leaving only silence and the echo of words that felt like a punch to the stomach. At the Anderson house, Robert was answering similar calls, his face getting redder with each conversation. I don't care what you think you saw, he told caller after caller. My daughter is a good girl from a good family. She would never... But the words stuck in his throat because deep down, he knew the callers were telling the truth. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, looking across the yard toward the Williams house, and for the first time in 17 years, she wondered if they had been fighting the wrong battle all along. The confrontation that had been building for nearly 18 years finally exploded like a dam bursting. Robert Anderson stormed over to the Williams house at 7 o'clock that same morning, pounding on the door with his fist and shouting loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "James Williams, you get out here right now. We need to talk about what your son has been doing with my daughter." James opened the door slowly, his face calm but his eyes alert. Behind him stood Grace, her hand on her husband's shoulder, ready to support him however he needed. "Good morning, Robert," James said quietly. "I think you need to lower your voice. Don't you tell me what I need to do." Robert screamed, his face purple with rage. "Your boy has been sneaking around with Emma, filling her head with ideas about college and love and God knows what else. This ends today." "My son," James said, his voice getting stronger with each word, "is a good young man who has worked hard and earned everything he has achieved. If your daughter cares about him, maybe you should ask yourself why, instead of assuming there's something wrong with it." Grace stepped forward, surprising both men. "Mr. Anderson," she said gently, "David and Emma have known each other since they were babies. They grew up together. Maybe what's happening between them is natural and good, and maybe we're the ones who have been making it complicated." Robert stared at Grace like she had spoken in a foreign language. "Natural? Good? A white girl and a black boy? Do you have any idea what people are saying about our families? Do you know what this could do to Emma's reputation? What about David's reputation?" James asked, his patience finally starting to crack. "What about his feelings? What about the fact that your daughter chose him, which says something about the kind of person he is?" The argument might have continued for hours, but Emma herself appeared at the front door, having heard the shouting from her bedroom window. She looked pale and determined, like someone who had been preparing for this moment her whole life. "Stop it," she said quietly, but something in her voice made all three adults turn to look at her. "All of you, just stop it. This isn't about you. This is about David and me, and what we feel for each other, and what we want to do about it." Robert's face went from purple to white. "Emma, get in the house right now. We'll discuss this privately." "No," Emma said, and the word hung in the air like a bell that had been rung. "I'm 18 years old. I'm graduating in 2 months. I've been accepted to Stanford University. I can make my own decisions about who I care about and why." At that moment, David appeared beside Emma, having run from the backyard where he had been listening to the whole confrontation. "Mr. Anderson," he said respectfully, "I know this is hard for you, but I love your daughter. I've loved her since we were children, and I want to spend my life making her happy." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear birds singing in the trees and cars driving on distant streets. Robert Anderson looked at the young man who had grown up next door, really looked at him for perhaps the first time, and saw not a threat or a problem, but someone who loved his daughter the way he had once hoped someone would. But 18 years of fear and prejudice don't disappear in a moment, even when faced with truth and love. The weeks that followed were the hardest of David and Emma's young lives. Both families had drawn battle lines, and the two teenagers found themselves caught in the middle of a war they had never wanted to fight. Robert Anderson forbade Emma from seeing David, taking away her car keys, her phone, and even her computer. He drove her to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon, watching her like a prison guard. "This is for your own good," he told her over and over. "Someday you'll understand." But Emma had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his blue eyes, and she found ways to resist that surprised everyone, including herself. She passed notes to David through mutual friends. She called him from the school library during lunch. She even convinced her grandmother to let her use the phone when she went to visit on Sundays. "Emma, honey," her grandmother said one afternoon, watching her granddaughter's face light up during a whispered phone conversation. "Are you sure this boy is worth all this trouble?" Emma looked at her grandmother, the woman who had taught her to be strong, to think for herself, to never let anyone else define her worth. "Grandma," Have you ever loved someone so much that you couldn't imagine your life without them? The older woman was quiet for a long moment, remembering her own young love, her own battles with family expectations. Yes, she said finally. I have. Then you know why I can't give up on David, Emma said simply. Meanwhile, David was facing his own family pressures, though they came from a place of worry rather than prejudice. Grace and James weren't angry about his relationship with Emma. They were terrified for his safety. Son, James said one evening as they sat on their back porch, I want you to be happy. Your mother and I both want that. But we also want you to be safe. And young black men who love white women. Sometimes they get hurt in ways that can't be healed. David looked at his father and saw decades of careful navigation through a hostile world. Years of choosing battles wisely and protecting his family above all else. Dad, I understand your fear, but I can't live my whole life being scared of what might happen. Emma makes me better than I am. She sees the best in me and brings it out. Isn't that worth fighting for? Grace joined them on the porch, tears in her eyes but love in her voice. David, we raised you to be brave and kind and true to yourself. If Emma Anderson is the woman you choose to love, then we will support you. But promise us you'll be careful. Promise us you'll think about what you're risking. I promise, Mama, David said, taking both his parents' hands. But I also promise that I won't give up on love just because it's complicated. The final confrontation came 2 weeks before graduation, when Emma made a choice that shocked both families and the entire community. She had been accepted to 3 colleges, Stanford in California, Northwestern in Illinois, and the local state university that her parents preferred. Everyone expected her to choose the safe option, to stay close to home where her family could continue to influence her decisions. Instead, Emma announced at dinner one evening that she had sent her acceptance letter to Stanford and her deposit for the dormitory. You did what? Robert roared, jumping up from the table so fast his chair fell over. I chose Stanford, Emma repeated calmly, though her heart was beating like a drum. I chose my future. Margaret looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. Emma, sweetheart, Stanford is so far away. And if David is going there too, then we'll have a chance to see if what we feel for each other is real, Emma finished. Away from all the fear and anger and history that makes it so hard to think clearly here. Robert's face cycled through every emotion. Rage, disappointment, fear, and finally, something that looked almost like respect. If you do this, he said slowly, if you choose him over your family, there may be no coming back. Emma looked at her father with eyes that held all the love and sadness in the world. Daddy, I'm not choosing him over you. I'm choosing love over fear. And someday, I hope you'll understand the difference. Graduation day arrived with sunshine and possibilities. David Williams walked across the stage as valedictorian, his parents cheering from the audience with tears of pride streaming down their faces. Emma Anderson was salutatorian, and as she gave her speech about courage and following your dreams, her eyes found David in the crowd and she smiled the smile that had been falling in love with him since they were children. After the ceremony, the 2 families found themselves standing awkwardly in the same section of the parking lot, surrounded by other graduates and their families. For a moment, it seemed like they might just nod politely and go their separate ways, maintaining the cold peace they had established. But then Emma's grandmother, who had driven in from 3 states away for the graduation, walked straight up to Grace Williams and extended her hand. Mrs. Williams, she said clearly, I'm Martha Anderson, Emma's grandmother. I wanted to meet the woman who raised such a fine young man. Grace looked surprised but took the offered hand warmly. Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. Emma is a lovely girl. You must be very proud. I am, Martha said, looking meaningfully at her son Robert and daughter-in-law Margaret. I'm proud of her intelligence, her strength, and her ability to know her own heart. She turned to David, who was standing respectfully nearby. Young man, I've heard a lot about you. Would you walk an old lady to her car? As David offered his arm to Emma's grandmother, she whispered something to him that made him smile and nod seriously. Then she called to Emma, Come help me with something in the car, dear. When all three of them reached the car, Martha Anderson did something that would become family legend. She opened her purse, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to Emma. "This is from your grandfather's life insurance policy," she said. "Money I've been saving for something important. I want you two to use it for your wedding someday." Emma stared at the envelope with wide eyes. "Grandma, you can't. We're not even. We haven't." "Haven't what?" Martha smiled. "Haven't been in love since you were 3 years old? Haven't been perfect for each other since the day you met? Haven't been fighting the whole world just to be together?" David looked from the envelope to Emma to her grandmother, understanding dawning on his face. "Mrs. Anderson, are you saying?" "I'm saying that love like yours is rare and precious and worth fighting for," Martha said firmly. "I'm saying that anyone with eyes can see that you two belong together. And I'm saying that it's time for this family to stop being afraid of happiness." Emma threw her arms around her grandmother and burst into tears, happy tears, relieved tears, tears that had been building up for years. David stood nearby, overwhelmed by the kindness of this woman who was choosing to see past skin color to the love in his heart. From across the parking lot, Margaret Anderson watched her mother embrace Emma and David, and something that had been frozen inside her for 18 years finally began to thaw. She walked over to Robert, took his hand and said quietly, "Our daughter is going to marry that young man someday. We can either be part of their happiness or miss out on it entirely." Robert watched his daughter's face, glowing with joy for the first time in months, and realized that maybe his mother-in-law was right about love being worth fighting for. 5 years later, David and Emma graduated from Stanford together, he with a degree in engineering, she with a degree in journalism. They were married that summer in the backyard between their childhood homes on Maple Street, with both families not only attending but helping to plan the celebration. Grace Williams and Margaret Anderson, who had become unlikely friends over the years, stood side by side during the ceremony, crying happy tears as their children promised to love each other forever. James Williams walked Emma down the aisle alongside Robert Anderson, both fathers finally understanding that they were gaining children, not losing them. The wedding was beautiful, but more importantly, it was joyful. The whole neighborhood came to celebrate, including some of the same people who had once whispered cruel words about the young couple. Love had not only conquered fear within the two families, it had begun to change an entire community. Robert Anderson, who had once built higher fences to keep the children apart, now took down the fence entirely and planted a garden that spanned both yards. "Borders," he told anyone who would listen, "are meant to be crossed by people brave enough to love." David and Emma's first child was born 2 years later, a little girl with her father's warm brown eyes and her mother's golden curls. They named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Hope that the next generation would grow up in a world where love was celebrated rather than feared, where children could be friends without their parents worrying about anything except their happiness and safety. And on quiet evenings, when the family gathered in the backyard that had once been divided by fear and prejudice, Grace would tell Hope the story of how her parents' love had changed not just two families, but an entire street, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with two children sharing a piece of birthday cake and discovering that friendship knows no boundaries. The Anderson house and the Williams house still stood side by side on Maple Street, but now they were connected by more than just proximity. They were connected by love, by family, and by the understanding that the best things in life are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win. Love had indeed conquered all, not easily, not quickly, but completely and forever. This concludes the epic love story of David and Emma, spanning 20 chapters and 5 parts, showing how love can triumph over prejudice, fear, and social barriers when people have the courage to follow their hearts and fight for what they believe in. Comment for Part 2.